Welcome. Folks are just coming in. We're going to get going in just a few moments. Excited rather to have a conversation with Bhaskar Sunkara and myself. I think it's a really timely conversation. The theme is taking heart in a heartless world. So we're going to, which is an intentional allusion to Marx often out of context quoted remarks on the theme. So we'll touch on that a bit and cover some other ground. And while folks are hopping in, just want to set the stage a bit. This is our third conversation in our monthly series on religion and socialism with DSA's Religion and Socialism Working Group. Again, honored to be in conversation with Bhaskar Sunkara, the founding publisher and editor of Jacobin magazine, which I believe is celebrating 10 years this year. Is that right?
Yeah, we just hit 10 years about a week ago. So yeah, it's been a great 10 years. I'm grateful for all the help of people in and around DSA. I think Maxine Phillips, who's in attendance, was an early person I reached out to and was in contact when I was just launching it. So there was a lot of people like that. Maxine, Joe Swartz, like Maria. A lot of people around DSA were very supportive early on. So I'm excited I've made it this far.
Wonderful news. It would not be the most comradely thing to not celebrate such a wonderful milestone. So certainly wanted to begin there. I'll say a few words about DSA and religious socialism, and then we'll just dive right on into it. For those who may be new, as well as those who may not be so new to DSA's religious socialism group, maybe DSA generally, our core organizing belief is that working people should govern the economy and society democratically to meet human needs, to have autonomy and agency flourish, as opposed to having the economy be run on the basis of profit for a few. DSA is organized through campus and community-based chapters whose members engage in everything from legislative to direct action, fighting for non-reformist reforms that empower working people. A brief word about the religious socialism piece. So religious socialism within what's now DSA has really been inspired by a vibrant tradition of folks committed to building a new society, an emancipatory society, in a way that's inspired by their faith. We're at a unique moment, I think, where religious folks, as is often the case, are working alongside unions within things like the Poor People's Campaign, other worker justice efforts. Some of these efforts are explicitly anti-capitalist and socialist in orientation. Others are not necessarily that, but are nonetheless doing great progressive work. But we also want to have the conversation in good faith, because there are versions of religion which justify the reproduction of inequality, justify extractive, exploitative economic practices, and that sometimes go so far as to argue sincerely, but mistakenly, that you can use the electoral cycle and a kind of garden variety democratic liberalism to tame the business cycle of capitalism and the market's excesses. So there's this kind of paradoxical element, a dialectic to religious engagement with politics generally and socialism, I think in particular, that defies easy categorization. So again, Bhaskar, excited to be in conversation with you. I believe we met many moons ago. I'm not sure if you recall it. It was at like a Verso, not a Versus, that's on Instagram, a Verso event. Do you recall that?
Yeah, I think like 2016, 2017 or something like that. I think in that range. Yes, I do recall.
Yeah, so good to be together again. Let's hop right on into it. So we'll start with a dear brother and Karl Marx, whose quote inspires tonight's theme. So there's a text from Marx where he's kind of riffing on Hegel, and he talks about how religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions. It's the opium of the people, right? We often talk about the opium of the people part, but the sigh of the oppressed creature and the heart of the heartless world piece doesn't always get airtime. And so I think for some, this quote suggests that religion is inherently a distraction from getting at the root causes of suffering, exploitation, all the rest. And I think this is an understandable, though lamentable position, I'd say, in some parts of the left. But there's also a case that could be made that Marx and his interpreters give us reason to kind of take heart in a heartless world. And what I mean by that is religion is potentially, not necessarily, but potentially a constructive force for advancing a socialist narrative, organizing electoral work. And so I want to turn the question to you, Bhaskar. What's your assessment of Marx's legacy, both in his own writing and among his interpreters, on how religion might intersect with socialism?
Well, I definitely have always taken the same argument as you, which is obviously just let's focus on this Marx, the opiate of the people line always is thrown out there, and it makes it seem like religion is a con. I mean, that's the way we were taught that Marx line in like a high school history class or something. I remember coming across it before I was really politicized. And obviously in full context, it takes on more nuance. So he's not necessarily against religion itself, but I would say he does think it's a symptom. And I think this gets to a deeper problem. I mean, and those of you who know me within DSA knows that I'm, if anything, excessively orthodox in my defense of Marx and a certain variety of Marxism. But I think this gets to a problem that exists in some of Marx's thought, which is that by rightly foregrounding the contradiction of class and the contradictions rooted in capitalism, I think he always tended to envision a post-political world. So in other words, when we think about within Marx's thought in his brief just sketches on socialism, him talking about the state being able to wither away, him talking about full communism, he's thinking about a world without contradictions. And in a way, so I'll loop back to the point, but in a way, when he's talking about a world without contradictions, it's not completely utopian, because his argument is that mass material abundance solves problems. So it's not like our consciousness because of socialism or communism, completely changes. No, there's such mass abundance that we change the way we relate to each other and to production. So Michael Harrington at the end of Socialism has a great passage where he talks about the desert, how water is treated. So in desert societies, marriages are brokered over water, people fight wars over water. Water is the most sacred, most important thing ever. So you can imagine somebody being taken from that society, and that's all they know, and that's what they know of water, and they think it's basically imbued in human nature, this relationship to water, and take them to contemporary Brooklyn on a hot summer day when someone opens up a fire hydrant for kids and to cool down or whatever else, right? Like that, they would just have their minds blown, or to see a water fountain, a public water fountain that no one is charging for. So I think that's what Marx is getting at when he's talking about how the end of capitalism, the creation of abundance, would get rid of a lot of contradictions. But I think that there's a permanence to religion, just like there's a permanence to politics, because religion solves problems, or at least speaks to something within us in all its various forms. It could be a more secular philosophical form or whatnot, but it speaks to deeper questions of the human condition that politics is not meant to solve. And we don't want politics to solve those things, because a lot of those things are actually deeply personal. These are deeply personal philosophical questions. These are about thinking about our place in the universe. And we don't want a totalizing politics. It would make religion unnecessary, if that makes sense. Though obviously we want a politics where a world where people maybe have more time for contemplation. So perhaps that means more time for religion. Perhaps that means more time for philosophy. At the very least, would make just a religious. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, yeah.
No, I think you hit on a number of important things. One, for those who might be interested in a particularly bracing case in this regard, well before Cornel West wrote Race Matters, his PhD was on the ethical dimensions of Marxist theory, which I think is a powerful work, because he makes a case that doesn't necessarily require religious belief, but it has a kind of ethical melody to it, because it takes a sort of appreciation, I think, of Marx's kind of early humanist sort of moves in order to see the bridge between where one might go ethically with Marx, where folks might take Marx from a religious perspective, but wherever one goes, I think there's room to credibly read Marx as not necessarily hostile to religion, not necessarily in an instrumental religious way, but to see him, and I appreciate you pushing on the point a bit, Bhaskar, that he does view religion as a symptom. And I think that's important to highlight because sometimes religious engagement with questions of justice and anti-capitalist work doesn't always get at the root causes. So I think that's a particularly powerful point that you raised there.
Yeah, and I also think, though, we should say that fundamentally, as socialists, our thought is rooted in something moral and ethical. And obviously, we all, each have to decide how we get to this place. But often, especially those of us from more Marxist tradition, we think of ourselves as scientific socialists. We don't often think about the moral and the ethical. But if we're using the framework of Marxism to identify exploitation, we still need a framework to tell us that exploitation is wrong, and particularly this form of exploitation is wrong. So I think a reasonable person, let's say even a Libertarian to Reason magazine, I have no doubt these people are against extreme forms of hyper-exploitation, like feudalism, like slavery, like other forms. Like they're against that, but they decide that the wage-labor relationship is not a form of exploitation that should be banned or not. But that's a normative judgment, and that requires some type of rooting to say that forms of hierarchy should be limited, and forms of exploitation and domination are social bads that should be limited. And historically, people have gotten that through religious framework. And it might be that obviously because of the role that religion has played historically, in the negative sense of being tied with state power and with ruling elites, it might be that was the way to smuggle in that framework. And it might be that it's less necessary today, that's the only route that people can get to the same thing. But yeah, that's been the root for millions and millions of socials, has been through that moral and ethical framework.
Yeah, I often think of A. Philip Randolph as an example in this regard. A. Philip Randolph worked with Chandler Owen. They put out a socialist magazine, The Messenger, got some traction in Harlem. And A. Philip Randolph and a lot of his biographers talk about how, though his own position was atheism in terms of like his religious belief, he had a deeply sensitive understanding of Black Pentecostalism, which then and now in Harlem has quite the hearing, and it made him more effective as an organizer and recruiting folks to, what ultimately becomes the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So I think that's an important point to highlight, that kind of moral, ethical imperative. Let's switch gears a bit. We all watched a cross between a debate / food fight of exchange last night. And you recently wrote, I think, a really compelling article in The Guardian, arguing that Scranton versus Park Avenue is probably the most effective contrast that the Biden campaign can draw. And if I understand your point, I think there's something of a juxtaposition that's grounded in class that I think you're getting at there. Could you maybe say a bit more about that?
Well, I mean, I do think that that right now, obviously, the American public is so polarized in the sense that, Trump has his base of 40%. He's never going to lose that base. He said it himself about that disgusting comment in 2016 about how he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue or whatever it was, Park Avenue, yep. Fifth Avenue, I think. Fifth Avenue, that's right. And he wouldn't lose. They would still vote for him. And that goes along the flip side too. I mean, the Democrats could nominate someone on the far left, like me or you, and we would get 40 something, percent. So, in other words, a lot of the Bernie Sanders campaign was about reaching and tapping into constituencies that had dropped out of politics, that we either thought it had nothing to offer them because they've seen just the impasse of modern politics, or just felt neither candidate, neither party was speaking to them. Often it was just a mobilizational, problem. Just, I have plenty of relatives that are broadly or anti-Republican. I think knee-jerk, like a lot of immigrants are in the U.S. But getting them registered, getting them to turn out, especially if you don't get the day off and the polls close and you have a million other things to do, it becomes it's very, very difficult. It requires effort. So the Sanders campaign premised itself on the idea that there was a new constituency out there and they could be tapped into. Irregular voters, semi-voters, a lot of them working class, a lot of them young. And it didn't work out. It worked out in certain areas. Like I think that turnout among Latino voters is really significant.
Nevada would be a great case. Yep.
But overall, it didn't work out. I think it's much harder to do in a closed primary than it is to do in a general election. And I think in general, rather than trying to win over a handful of Republican voters might be swayed in the suburbs, just speaking to a message will actually turn out your base and maybe make it so that you can break even or get pretty close among white working class voters. That's not even a revolutionary act. This is what Obama did in his 2 terms, and he's hardly a radical, but it is different than the Clinton approach in 2016. And yeah, that's my general.
Yeah, no, that's a helpful point. There's a question that has emerged in the chat, which talks about the role of religion in sustaining struggle through seemingly endless setbacks, setting a tone of respect and support. What other forces can provide that? I'll take a stab at this and then would love for you to weigh in here as well. I think there's something to be said for religion's potential role, and I keep saying potential because I think the multivalence, the differing varieties of religious experience, to bring William James into the conversation, are important to ground the conversation, because there's never just one stream of religious tradition that we're talking about, even internal to a particular religious tradition. And you mentioned Obama. Interestingly enough, he was the one who spoke about how, you can get Jerry Falwell and you can get Al Sharpton from the same kind of Christian tradition in some ways. But to this particular question, I think there is something to be said for ritual, for transcendence, which may come from a sense of connecting with God, may come for others from music, from nature, from a deep sense of play, silence, stillness, etc. That definitely gets to Lita, your question. In terms of what other forces can provide that, I think it's important to note that here in New York, there's a ethical culture society. There's a tradition of relating to one another and regarding what it is to be human as just inherently sacred, that I think is, or special, however we might language that, that's important to acknowledge. Curious to hear how you might weigh in there in terms of what sustains folks through setbacks, right, labor repression, etc.
Well, I think regardless of whether we are believers or not, I think the socialist cause itself and our identification with the tradition and a history and the multi-generational connection that makes. I mean, I think we can, in fact, draw a direct line of continuity from our movement on the modern left to the abolitionist movement, until before then, Thomas Paine and others, and just many generations of people struggling, Eugene Debs and others struggling to make the world a better place. And we're living, I mean, it seems terrible every day, right? It seems like not a great world in many ways, but we're not living in the worst of all possible worlds. And the reason for that is because of generations of sacrifice and struggle. And that's why I think we need to honor those victories, the victories of the labor movement, the victories of the civil rights movement, the victories in recent decades, and not just note our setbacks and defeats, but note our victories, but feel this sort of continuity. And I do think that often, pejoratively, socialism is compared by its detractors to a religion. Now, I do think that there is something.
I think that's a point worth digging into a bit.
Yeah, I think that actually, I feel like my conviction to socialism is basically religious in the sense that, to me, at least at a moral and ethical level, an opposition to forms of domination and hierarchy, exploitation, however you want to put it, or even just plain bullying, right? Like I think that's one way to frame what socialists want. We don't want a world in which the mighty can bully the weak. You know, we want
Yep.
a world with that kind of equality. That's an ethical, commitment. That's a moral commitment, and that to
Yep.
me is
That is
not
cool.
falsifiable by the actions or the mistakes. It might be that it's a technical impossibility. You can convince me that my moral worldview, which is my moral worldview, is impossible to put into practice fully in the real world because of technical contradictions and problems or whatnot. Like that, at least, like is an argument. But whereas Marxism, for example, is an intellectual framework to understand the world, which we should embrace, I think, but we should also not be wedded to because it's an intellectual framework to understand the world. If it no longer explains something about the world, then we should jettison the parts of it that are no longer useful. But I feel like the commitment, the moral and ethical commitment, is a long-lasting thing. But the last thing I'll say is I actually have felt a very deep kingship through the years, since the time when I was a teenager. I was politicized in the socialist movement with generations, and I was lucky enough to meet many older generations of socialists. Some of them have already passed away, and feel this connection to our history and our sense of struggle, and that also helps us see the bigger picture and not feel so small. And also, when it comes to our little petty sectarian rivalries, if we
Yep.
feel like we're part of the same thing, then what difference does it make that we disagree on obviously I don't think we actually disagree, but we disagree on what to do in one election cycle or something like that, if we're part of this broad, multi-generational, almost trans-historical movement. You know, when Marx had the little questionnaire, the little game where he had to list his favorite figure from antiquity, like, who did he write? He wrote Spartacus, Spartacus,
Yep.
so obviously he thought himself as part of this this trans-historical movement
Across
as well.
space
Yeah.
and time. I think that's an important point. There are a number of questions in the chat, which I'll do my best to try to consolidate and synthesize into one. And then just to kind of give you a prep, I want to talk a bit about Jacobin and how you all have covered religion, which I think is in a pretty subtle way. The synthesis of the questions, I think, is what more can be said at a 30,000 foot level beyond sometimes religion is a force for socialism, and sometimes religion is a force for regressive hierarchy, propping up, so on and so forth. I think one thing that I'd say I think within various religious traditions, there are strains of praxis, of organizing, of reflection that I think are worth lifting up. I think of someone like Martin Buber, whose work on utopia, whose text I Am Thou is pivotal in the long and rich strain of thinking about Jewish socialism. I think about Alice Walker, whose poem on democratic socialist womanism brings together a distinct tradition of Black women's empowerment with talking about democratic socialism. There's, of course, the often quoted liberation theology, traditions of Latin America, of Black American thought. And there's a lot of rich synthesis by Buddhists on love and rage that can help us get towards, as you mentioned, Bhaskar, a world where there's not bullying by the mighty with respect to the weak. So just wanted to set that out before. So I think it's important to be able to go beyond saying, Moses was a leftist, Jesus was a leftist. Think again and looking at the Prophet Muhammad, who's more left than you might imagine. Though it's true that you can mobilize origin stories and founders in multiple directions, I think understanding religious traditions as ways to answer perennial political questions is what I'm getting at. Questions of authority, questions of representation, distribution, and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could definitely find these examples, in the Hebrew Bible and in Islam. You could find it like the Hebrew Bible's kind of anger at those who rob the poor ones of justice.
Quote the text, Bhaskar.
Yeah, but I think in particular though, and my own family backgrounds, Hindu, so I'm kind of impartial in these things. So
Yeah.
I'll maybe focus too much on certain traditions because I'll just focus on what I know, to be honest. But I think in particular, since Buddhism emerged as a revolt against the caste system because of the very humble origins and persecutions of early Christianity, I think those in particular have been real sources of strength, and it's been a really wide tradition. So you have someone like in Canada, the Canadian Social Democrat Tommy Douglas kind of background as a radical Baptist. You have obviously the Protestant social gospel. You have the Diggers and the Levelers in England. You have Martin Luther King Jr. And then obviously I think more in the contemporary sense, I think a lot of the focus has been on the Catholic tradition, not just liberation theology. I think a much broader strand of the Catholic tradition. So that's all there, right?
And things of that sort, for instance.
Yeah, and even like even when we think about the Irish national liberation tradition, the Starry Plough in Ireland has Catholic roots. It's derived from Isaiah, that line, which is I think the swords into plowshares line. So and beyond that, I mean, I'm not obviously there's lots of contradictions in their actual practice, but the Prime Minister of the Australian Labor Party actually gave an incredible speech in the 40s, the Light on the Hill speech. And so when we think about that Reagan line, the shining city on a hill, actually in many ways he was aping and perverting a really, really beautiful speech. I don't have it in front of me, but I recommend everyone read this Light on the Hill speech. And it's about, using religious imagery, but talking about how the job of labor, the job of the working class, isn't just to make more money or just to improve standards of living. So that was really important. The objective was kind of the betterment of mankind in kind of a broader, more philosophical sense. So obviously we could sit here all day and list various examples of religion being employed in these ways. What I would distinguish though is a couple things. I think the most important thing that we establish at a minimum is that I'm very glad that there's not really a big trend of DSA that is particularly, I imagine a large chunk of DSA is atheistic, but there's no large anti-theist strand. In that, I think that would be extremely alienating if we had that. And within the left, I think we should separate between certain traditions we have within the left that are anti-clerical in the sense of going against hierarchies wherever they exist, including in
religious
spheres. Obviously, not all some anti-clerical traditions are extremist and just as destructive as fundamentalist religious traditions. But broadly, I think there's an anti-clerical tradition that is also very compatible with even with different forms of socialist thought. I think that's an important part. In other words, we can't just say, oh, there's a religious community that we have to respect because that's a organic community. Because as we know, within our families, within our communities, there are exploitative relationships, there are hierarchies, and we want politics to penetrate in there, not to free people from above, but to give people exit options and whatever else. So I think we should recognize that. Yeah.
Let me hop in there on that point. I think a part of what you raise is the importance of forthright conversation about religion that subjects it to not being so tenderly held that it can't bear ruthless criticism. And I think that's a gift of Marx. In the same critique of Hegel's philosophy on the right, where he not only says religion is the opiate of the people, side of the oppressed groups, and so on and so forth, he talks about how the criticism of religion, and I'm paraphrasing, is kind of fundamental to all good social criticism generally, that in some ways that's a critical starting point. And there's a way to read criticism as a kind of cynical act of despair where you're constantly kind of poking holes because of ridicule and contempt. But there's also critique in the sense of a running thread of argument, constantly trying to revise into better, more noble versions, and then also just conditions of freedom require that one can't just shield themselves in religious practice, particularly if it's harming others, if it's causing trauma, if it's aiding and abetting oppression and so forth. So I think you gestured towards something important there. I want to raise this question. Throughout the 10 years that Jacobin has been in existence, you all have published a fair amount of articles on everything from new atheism to how fundamentalism across various religious traditions has emerged, certainly a good deal in between those poles. I'm wondering if you can say a bit about what you see as religion's role when it comes to crafting a public narrative for socialism, to build a constituency for it. What might that look like?
Well, I think for one thing, we haven't published a lot on religion other than the kind of anti-theism perspective, with the critique of some of the new atheists and how their politics are utilized, and also historical pieces that talk about various strengths that people have drawn from religion, like a lot of, just by nature of having a lot of Latin American, a lot of Irish contributors. I think disproportionately a lot of many of the articles have been written on the role of certain varieties of liberation theology and other parts of the Catholic tradition. Obviously, we publish a few things every year on Oscar Romero and others, of course.
But there's been a few. There's been some on, Cornell. There's been some on a number of different.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let me make two clear points. One is that I think part of why the left draws on the religious tradition is that, in fact, religion and the church has been a training ground historically for mass politics within working class movements. So many of our leaders they learned how to speak because they learned how to speak in a church or other religious institutions. I think there was a certain style of engagement and debate in many different traditions, but especially the Jewish and Christian ones in the U.S. That came out of this organic connection. So I think that's important. The other thing that I'll point out is that we're living in an age right now where there's the hollowing out of every single civic institution. Everything is hollowed out. Church attendance is down and union attendance is down. And yes, historically, unions have obviously benefited the left. And in modern times, unfortunately, at least the white evangelical, or not even white, they're multiracial, but disproportionately white evangelical churches, have benefited the right in modern times, of course, and throughout the Civil War in that period, that those traditions were great forces of emancipation and progress.
Slightly different picture.
But in other words, if one of the problems with the left today in the United States, and one of the problems that we're meant to overcome with DSA, is the fact that we don't have this deep rootedness in working class communities, then I think we need to place a special emphasis on people who are engaged in one of the last institutions in civil society that are still mobilizing and bringing people together and have the potential to bring people together across races, of course, national origin or whatnot. So I think there's a particular way in which, if DSA has a bigger proportion of its members who are doing regular in regular church attendance, it'll be a good sign. It'll be a good sign that we're more working class. I'm not saying entryism, right? I'm not a I go to a temple or do a puja when my mom asks, but I'm not a believer. I'm not going to at least in that way. I'm not going to do an entryist thing at a church. I'm not suggesting that, but it'll be a good sign.
Yeah, I hear the point you're saying. I take your point to be, if it's the case that you have a hollowing out of civil society, which I think a lot of empirical sociological research bears out, and you have, to some degree across demographics, bucking that trend, religious participation has not dropped quite as sharply as some of the other decreased forms of association, whether it's voluntary organizations, unions, etc. If we suppose, and I think rightly so, that there are some folks who are in temples, synagogues, mosques, other kinds of religious assemblies that have a desire to see a world where power imbalances of exploitation are not the norm, are not the order of the day, then making that kind of bridge there is important because you see religion showing up in the lives of working class, the interior lives, I might add, of working class folks in many of those institutions. So I think that's an important point to make in terms of strategy. I don't think we have to be necessarily bashful about that point, but there's also a way to do it in a principled kind of way, if I hear you, and kind of avoiding the kind of entryism that you talk about. Want to go to a question and get it up on the table before us. So Vincent has rose for us a question about how one intersection of labor and faith in the late 19th, early 20th century was unable to kind of separate religion and politics. So religion and politics kind of collapsed, I think is the claim, into propaganda. And so, you know, it's interesting. I read a good piece on Jacobin that talked about how you can write from a place of political commitment and kind of reimagining what is meant by propaganda. So the question on the table I'd put that I'd love for you to touch a bit is, what does it mean to think about propaganda and articulating a distinct point of view in the world without being like a steamroller as you kind of exchange regions and engage in debate? I think that's at the heart of the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to allow for nuance and contradictions. So in other words, we don't want to be dogmatic to say there's only one reading of the world, there's only one reading of religious text, right? I think we strengthen our case when we acknowledge doubt and contradictions and explain these things thoroughly. And I think the same goes for when we're engaging in religious circles. I mean, often I imagine people should just talk personally about what they think something means and why it speaks to them and why that also motivates them to maybe support something like Medicare for all. And in general, like what and many DSA members have learned after years of organizing, that generally we know less about someone's situation than they do. Always, we know less about another person's situation than they know about their own situation. So if you're engaging in a conversation with someone for the first time, if you're organizing and trying to get someone to do something, you should be spending most of that conversation asking people questions, asking them what they think. And at the end of it, they'll probably feel like they had a good conversation if they did most of the talking, right? And even if there were disagreements. And on the actual history, I actually don't know enough to say. I would imagine that well, I just do know that religious movements have been intertwined with political movements for a long time. Many of them have lasted for a very long time. So I think there's plenty of reasons to avoid using either intellectual thought or religious thought as in very narrow ways, just because it's not as effective. And yeah, bank shots and glancing blows are often better than direct ones.
Excellent point. Would add there, because I think this is the other end. You make a great point about allowing for nuance and contradiction, engaging in inquiry, raising questions, listening more than you talk. I think a part of what this may be getting at, there is a bit of historiographical work to suggest that some religious folks who support the New Deal, for instance, could be seen as engaging in sloganeering rather than making a full-bore case for why you need some sort of regulatory state to kind of provide public goods and programs, so on and so forth. So I think there's something to be said for not just leaning on a kind of smug self-assuredness that one's position is right, but listening to objections to a socialist case and making the argument in a kind of contextual sort of way. I think that's also connected to the propaganda question. There's another question I want to get on the table before we turn in earnest to Q&A. And that question is, what might be the role of, or as we think about intersections between religion and socialism, what are the biggest challenges and opportunities for platforms that are targeting these specific audiences? And just to maybe flesh that out as a bit of background, Bhaskar. So you have groups like Religious Socialism, you have The Bias, which is an outlet of the Institute for Christian Socialism. I'll just name the Christian ones, though I'm sure there are a number of other entities. I think of Believers for Abolition, which is an Islamic group. And you have these entities, basically podcasts and magazines, which are getting a hearing for socialism and are translating it to folks of faith. What would you say are some of the potentially transferable lessons that Jacobin could give to some of these burgeoning efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to give a really apolitical answer, but I think a lot of these questions are just technical ones. It doesn't really matter what your content is. So in other words, there's a certain market for, let's say, connecting Islam in the U.S. with progressive causes. There's obviously long traditions of doing so in the United States, in the Black community, and among immigrant groups. I know a lot of Bengali leftists who are Muslims and kind of cite and use their faith as kind of a reason why they're on the left. I think to reach those people, it's similar to reaching the target audience for something like Jacobin. It requires figuring out how to connect with people, figuring out a business model to make sure you're able to sustain a staff and build subscriptions and donors and whatever else. So I think the biggest challenge is just the potential size of the market, if that makes sense. Because the left right now, like I said, our overriding problem is that we're not as embedded as we should be. We're growing very wide, and we have a lot of people within, let's say, the tent of DSA, which is incredible. But we're a country of 330 million people, and often it's very difficult for us to recruit en masse the way we used to be. It used to be that there was a huge union campaign in a city like Lowell, and within 2 years, the Wobblies would get thousands of members, right? And there'd be thousands of people showing up to this political activity. Or, you would organize people not in ones and twos, but in mass. And obviously religion played a way. Right now, we're seeing the breakdown of a lot of these things. And this sounds very apolitical. I keep talking about breakdown of civil society, breakdown a lot of these institutions. It's not apolitical for just this reason alone. The right does not need mobilized people, organized people in civil society. They could govern capitalism in the interest of capitalists with people not even turning out to vote, right? We to solve our collective action problem, need unions, need people doing organizing in their churches and mosques and temples. And like I said, I might be too modest. I think everyone on this chat is better equipped to answer this question than me. But I think that in general, us looking at the amount of DSAers engaged in these communities is going to be a barometer of our rootedness and a barometer of our success, rather than a shortcut to our success, if that makes sense.
It does. What I'd add there, and hopefully you see this as a friendly addition. I remember when Jacobin was first getting off the ground, that there were reading groups which served as a space of connection, of community, of entry into socialism, into Marx, any number of other things. And I think there's something to be said for reading circles as a point of introduction, a point of association with other people, so that sometimes this is an unfair caricature of socialists, but it's not entirely unmoored from reality. There's a perception that sometimes socialists are more radical in their heads than they are in actual organizing and day-to-day work to disrupt capitalism. And so I think in terms of specifically to get at a particular question, folks looking to kind of creatively reroute their traditions in a counter-hegemonic way, to use Gramsci's sort of language. I think reading circles are an excellent way to do that. Want to make sure that we tackle the other end of the question or of this conversation before we go to Q&A. So this will be our last question, and then we'll swing it open for, I think we can do at least a good 15, 20 minutes of Q&A. So we've talked a lot about how religion can support socialist movements. We've talked about the kind of exemplars which you can find in every religious tradition. We've talked a lot about constituency-based reasons. We've talked about building outlets which can learn perhaps from Jacobin and other ways of targeting specific communities and demographics to kind of get the word out there and to evoke conversation. Want to deal now with the question of what kinds, how do we sort of intervene in religion being a more corrosive force? And what I mean by that is, I think we have to take seriously, and these questions are coming up in the chat, I think at least two sorts of challenges, and I want to bring you in after I just kind of quickly stipulate them. I think the first challenge is a Pollyannish sentimentality, and by that I mean talking about building beloved community and airbrushing how toxic and thoroughgoing all the way down the contradictions of capitalism are. And so if the thought, as it sometimes is in the religious left, is that if you do enough prayer vigils, if you bear enough witness, and Adolph Reed is good in making that kind of critique, that bearing witness will somehow be like a tipping point in radicalizing people in and of itself, as opposed to, say, organizing. So a kind of overemphasis on bearing witness among the religious left, I think, is one challenge. The other challenge of when religion may undermine rather than strengthen socialist movements is the kind of packaging problem, I'd put it, of talking about what makes socialism compelling from an ethical or religious perspective, like in a one-liner. And I think you did that really well when you talked about living in a world where the mighty don't bully those who don't have the same kind of power. That's quick. That's an easy sort of distillation of how to see the world in a different perspective, rather than a more, a Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek sort of way of looking at the world. So would love to hear your take on how to move beyond ethics and religious engagement with socialism as a kind of witness bearing only.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so obviously, I agree with Professor Reed on most things, but I think in this case it's like I don't think you could have I don't think you could have enough a witness bearing. I think if you consider most the arc of modern U.S. politics, I mean, I think as a precondition for us to organizing, we have to speak about the horrors that we see. We have to prevent those horrors from being normalized, and we have to levy our critique of the world as it is. So we have to present that in addition to a vision of a better world. But more importantly, I think this is where the socialist part comes in. We need a way to get from here to there. Because I think a lot of people agree with us about what's unjust in the world, but they often think that, it can't be any other way, right? I have to get mine, you have to get yours, and, this is just the way it is. It's unfortunate. So often people will justify a framework built on exploitation and built on this kind of a really insidious competition, but they would never treat their family members that way, right? They would never treat their friends that way. I think we really do value relationships that are deeper there. But I actually think that one is a necessary precondition of the other, and I think many of the problems that we've seen is that in a lot of these religious traditions, or kind of mainstream expressions of religion in recent year, it's been not bearing witness but justifying injustice, or trying to solve it with acts of personal charity, right? You need to get wealthy, and of course when you're wealthy you should give back, to the church, you give back to the less fortunate, but not questioning the fundamental inequities. So obviously, and actually, Sarah noted in the chat, someone who I'm sure people have listened to her podcast, and can, again, another person who can speak much more eloquently than me on this issue. But obviously, the Christian right does have really deep and rooted institutions. I think we'll probably find that those will be in decline at some point, as well. But that kind of big business they've set up around religion, is the existing structures, and are very impossible to penetrate, because it is it's backed by paid staffers and by whatever else. But the reason why people are attracted to it is for the same reason that the rest of us are attracted to religion and to these criticisms. But yeah, I shouldn't overstate the decline in attendance and other things.
Yeah, y'all forgive me. I bet you can get one more question on the table that I think comes at the socialism end, and then we'll swing it open. In terms of the path to get from here to there, this is hopefully responsible oversimplification. There's one path which is what you might call the autonomous politics path, right? Which is mutual aid, worker cooperatives, community land trust, socializing property, but doing that independent of the state, with the idea being that if you do enough of this, maybe the state is kind of a junior partner to community-controlled efforts. But maybe over time, this is kind of Eric Olin Wright's case, you can kind of gradually move towards a more socialist world. The other case, and again, I'm intentionally kind of drawing polls, is more electoral, more state power oriented, get socialists in office, every branch of government if you can, and then move towards what I believe you call in your book a kind of confrontational social democracy, or something along contentious social democracy, something along those lines. What's your take on the best path from a socialist standpoint to get to the world we want to see?
Yeah, so it's a cop-out to say do both. So I would say that they're both not completely
Where do you place your
incompatible.
emphasis?
But yeah, emphasis on the latter. And the reason is, I think in the process of building these our parties, our movements, our struggles, we're going to have to create a lot of these institutions. I mean, what is a strike fund other than, is it not kind of a kind of member-driven, small d democratic, mutual aid project? What are a party school or a adult literacy class that a mass party would have, or other things? It's mixing in politics with social service works. But ultimately, the state would crush any of our efforts, and the capitalists would crush any of our efforts, unless we can wield the state, unless we can wield scale. So capital always tries to dilute the scale of struggle to the most local and isolated struggles. I think traditionally, the goal of socialists have been bigger in a unitary state. So let's just think about even the Black freedom movement, from the end of slavery to Reconstruction, to the New Deal, to kind of our next Reconstruction, the Civil Rights movement. All this has been done with massive increases in state power and massive transformations of the U.S. state in a more democratic direction. And it obviously hasn't solved, half of what needs to be solved, but it did happen at that level. But at the same time, there's mass movements. When you think about the abolitionist movement, and you think about the Civil War and Reconstruction, and you think about the Civil Rights Movement, you're thinking about the small d democratic actions of individuals. You're thinking about the role of churches, among a million other groups acting, but they're acting to pressure and put into concert the state. So yes, the state does have a class bias. I don't want to get into kind of these questions of state theory, but it is democratically responsive to a large degree, and I think that kind of needs to be our emphasis. But of course, when it comes to what we should do in our personal lives or in our politics, like a lot of the, I think, impulse that makes people want to do politicized mutual aid is just the good impulse that makes people want to do charity. So I think we should make clear that we are against charity as the solution to social ills, but we're for charity just as part of living a good and virtuous life. And in other words, there's a certain form of analysis. It's important, right? Exactly. We care about structures, but there's also, I think our own individual autonomy and ethical decisions, and also how we treat and interact with each other, which I think is really important, and sometimes is underemphasized by socialists.
Excellent point. I think about the Black Panther Party, which would often talk about whose free breakfast program started in the basement of a church, by the way, St. Augustine's Episcopal Church. But they talked about survival programs pending revolution. And so work on sickle cell anemia, cop watch programs, school breakfast programs, which, as it turns out, ultimately do get kind of scaled up through the state, speak to this way to engage in charity and mutual aid work. And this is a practical way to kind of segue into Q&A. I think that work comes easier for religious communities to do the mutual aid, to do the charity, to be in solidarity with striking workers, but to not stop there and to connect the love to the transformative justice work. So with that, would love to hear some questions from folks. People have already begun to drop them in the chat. So just giving folks a heads up that for the next 15, we'll take some of these questions, and then we'll kind of close out with some concluding words and a kind of call to action. The first question, I'm going to kind of go in reverse order, talks about how while civil, okay, you addressed Sarah's question there. Another one here, as a democratic, socialist, feminist, and mediator, I witnessed an alarming amount of, so I think that the question on the table here is, how do we deal with the kind of corruption and corrosion of associating together, betrayal, lying, ridicule, manipulation, dishonesty, even in the context of socialist work?
Yeah, I mean, that's a problem with human beings, with hierarchies, and with organizations, period. And again, I don't think even this is a problem that socialism can fully solve. I think it can make things better and give people more exit options. But ultimately, I mean, this is why politics needs to be permanent, but also beyond that, this is why we need, it's no guarantee, but we need to fight for accountability and democracy and transparency and all these other things to give us an option to solve these problems. But in other words, the same thing comes to any hierarchy, to any institution, and that's not a reason to avoid these organs of collective action, these organs of faith or whatnot, but it's something we always need to be aware of. And I guess this slightly touches on what I was trying to distinguish before about the validity and necessity of, call it anti-clerical, it's a little bit antiquated, you call it just in general, movements from within religious communities that combat hierarchies within religious communities and fight to reform them. Because, I'll give an example. It's kind of a straw man example, but we saw some tensions, for example, and some debates on the UK left between young left-wing Muslims who were critical of some parts of the anti-war movement for accepting the leadership of right-wing community leaders that did have audiences. And it's a complicated argument because one, those leaders were actually adamantly against the Iraq War and were mobilizing people to fight against a brutal war that killed thousands of people. But also, they saw it as a betrayal because, they're engaging in this struggle and we're, kind of creating this mass front that's capitulating to this hierarchy. So I think those are the types of things we'll have to figure out on a political basis. I tend towards just making sure that even though we're embracing our religion in certain forms, we're embracing the faithful and their struggles, we're always aware that a lot of these are institutions that are corrosive, that are connected with hierarchies, are connected with right-wing politics and other things that undermine people's lives in every single other sphere of life when they're not in that church.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point that, and a double-sided point that corruption, lying, ridicule, a number of other things that were lifted up are lamentably part and parcel of organizational, social life, and their reoccurring existence is in no way an excuse to tolerate those things and not push against them by instituting practices, transparency, accountability, and all the rest that you mentioned. There is a question which is on the table now, and I definitely want to encourage folks to continue submitting questions. As I'm looking at this, I see that there is a number of questions that we've moved through here. So one question that is on the table talks about this. Is there a strand of socialism that says the world is unfixable, but we should engage in the struggle anyway? A quick response I'll give that, and then I want to bring you in, Bhaskar. I think this is a characterization that he probably accepts. Derek Bell, the legal scholar who in many ways is a creator of critical race theory, has this idea of racial realism, which essentially argues that not just culturally, but some of the material dimensions of racism are so locked and embedded in American society that the degree to which we can make seismic changes, I don't know if he'd say unfixable, but he'd say the prospects of a victory that's just around the corner are pretty slim. But his counsel was to struggle on because of, in many ways, it kind of aligns with what you said earlier, a kind of witness bearing, doing something because it's kind of inherently right. And I think his work, Faces in the Bottom of the Well, and a number of other texts, I think emerge from that kind of strand that the struggle is its own reward, even as we want to win alongside and on behalf of working class folks. Anything you have there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I want to live in a fixable world, to be honest, because that sounds like because in other words, like that's a very subjective thing. And it sounds like an authoritarian sort of world where you're saying that this is the end goal. And I think that's kind of a dangerous impulse because one, it could justify any means to get there. And also, beyond that, like a lot of our problems, there's a human condition that is not fixable, right? There's heartbreak, there's all sorts of things that might exist, and social problems too that might exist even when we solve our immediate needs. So I think in other words, if your definition of unfixable is a world without poverty, a world where everyone has a chance to reach their potential, that's I think, in other words, that's a world we can achieve. That's a fixable world. Even a world without racism, I think that's going to take a long struggle and many generations of work. But I do think it's an achievable world. But if you mean a world without, there's certain forms of suffering that I think are just eternal. And also, again, that's what I got at the very beginning of the conversations when we were talking about, that's why I think forms of religion and other forms of philosophy as well will be eternal. And again, like I think we wouldn't necessarily want to live in a world without our human condition because it's sorry, this is a totally flat way to end the sentence, but it makes us human.
No, I hear what you're saying. So there's a bit of pushback that I think is emerging in the chat. So want to hop in response to your question, and then want to lift up a question that's here. I think there's a tension between having a sense of urgency and momentum about trying to win particular things, and kind of trying to extend the memory of effective revolution. So, you know, we often talk about the American Revolution, French Revolution, but forget or downplay the Haitian Revolution, which was an effective overthrow and pushback against the French empire, setup of an entirely different state. Generally, over the long run, we might make some quibbles here and there, but a successful revolution in a near-term case, we could say. But all of the social problems of Haitian society, for any number of reasons, of course, were not solved. So there's some tension, I think, between this particular social evil is abolished that keeps people in the game, and that we want to see, and there is more to be done. And I frame it appealing to the Haitian Revolution, because there's a question from Max in the chat that says, doesn't saying there always will be problems because we're human, isn't that an excuse for essentially not adopting a course towards revolution that substantial structural transformation might be another way to put that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be, but it also could be a, you know, or also on the other hand, it could be still striving to make change and to make revolution, because again, the Haitian Revolution was did not create a perfect society, but also eliminated a slave society. So, you know, that's imperfect progress, but it's still a major progress. But I think it's best to assume that all our contradictions won't be resolved in one simple blow. Then for us to figure out what are the institutions that will carry forward democratic struggle, even quote unquote after the revolution, however you want to define that. So the revolution might be the victory of a Salvador Allende type, you know, government, right? You maintain ways to keep the party alive for the second generation in power, to keep the transformations going. It could be, you know, this or that, but I think it's a deeply held idea within the DSA tradition, in particular, the democratic socialist tradition of Harrington and Howe and many others, that this idea of I think Joe Swartz put it this way in his first book, the permanence of the political, and I think that's an important idea.
I want to underscore that point and try to make two quick points as I'm encouraging folks to continue to hop in with the questions in the chat, and be provocative. Provocative questions are always good. I think your point, Bhaskar, about supporting institutions of democratic struggle that can kind of continue the permanence of the political is a helpful point to share, because I think there's a bit of romanticism and voluntarism on the left that doesn't always appreciate the role of institutions as important and essential to building an egalitarian society. And what I mean by that is this. I think sometimes there is, for instance, an over eagerness, not always, but sometimes, to celebrate people flooding the streets as an inherently good thing that will yield material results in the long run. I think there are inherent cultural benefits and potentially inherent materialist benefits, but not necessarily so. And of course, we could make a similar sort of pushback against institutions, but the distinction, and I think it's one that you appealed to in talking about state power, is that the state has a way of consolidating whatever gains may be secure, even as we have to push back against its excesses, police violence, mass incarceration, things of that sort. And I think Michael Walzer is someone in the democratic socialist tradition who I think moves, who helped get Dissent magazine off the ground, moves in between a kind of Jewish tradition of socialism, as well as talking about political theory in accessible ways. I commend spheres of justice, an exodus and revolution, particularly for you in the chat, Max. You're pushing the question revolution. I think Walzer is clear and compelling on some of the religious as well as political challenges of revolution. Bhaskar, were you about to hop in?
No. I think that was well put.
Okay. Any final questions before we close out? All right.
By the way, somebody did ask about This Life, that book by Martin Haglund.
Lift it up.
Yeah, my fiance is reading it now, or was reading it. She's studying for the bar exam now, so hasn't been reading anything besides for that for a few months. But so I plan on reading it. I've read a few interviews with him. It definitely seems like a very compelling book about ethics and these other really important questions by a Marxist. So I imagine it'll be of interest to people. But I haven't. I've listened to an interview with him. I haven't read it yet.
I think it's. I haven't yet read the text, so maybe that's a reading club piece to look into. A part of, just to translate quickly for folks, This Life, at least if this is a dangerous way to proceed, but if reviews are to be believed, makes a nuanced and compelling case, a compelling moral case, I would even argue, for democratic socialism that argues that this life should be the focus, and that a focus on whatever may happen in the life to come, while that may offer some solace and consolation, could potentially be a distraction from doing the work of organizing and movement building that needs to take place. Again, haven't read the text, but that is the review that I believe Dissent magazine ran, or Boston Review, one of those two outlets ran. Even if what I've said is off base, I think it's important and ethical to let everyone make their case in their own terms and to take it seriously. So I may have gotten the basic case wrong, but I think that's an important part of the conversation to hear. Want to lift up one more particular question, which I think cuts out a bit wider than this particular conversation, but there's a question on the table about the relationship between socialism and communism, which I think is on the table. And would just briefly say there, I think a part of the nuance and complexity that I lift up is that you have folks whose journey is complex. I think of Bayard Rustin, who over the course of his life models a deep Quaker piety, who's a communist, who's a deep socialist, who was marginalized in ways he should not have been due to being queer. And I say it in the context of the time because I think he was pilloried and dehumanized by folks, even including folks like King, because of his sexuality. I think we have to be honest about that with Rustin. But I lift him up in this context because he embodied a kind of communist as well as socialist kind of fluidity that I think is important to lift up. So just wanted to get that on the table. I want to turn now to just some kind of concluding words and calls to action. The first is thank you all so much for joining us. Know there were a number of things taking place within DSA this evening, and really appreciate folks hanging with us tonight. The first is we're in the midst of a recruitment drive, DSA 100K. So want to invite folks to invite your sister, your brother, your cousin, auntie, uncle, all them to join DSA. Organization and association helps to deepen the impact that we can have in dislodging capitalism and moving towards socialism. So definitely want to encourage folks to join DSA. Bhaskar, want to turn it to you. Please tell folks about your excellent book, which is in paperback, I believe now, the Socialist Manifesto, and anything else you want to say to help close us out.
Well, first of all, just thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure talking to you. Thanks to Lawrence and Maxine and everyone else involved in making the event happen. It was a nice conversation because it was outside my usual comfort zone for sure. So, I felt a bit embarrassed even in the chat because I recognize so many names that I know so many people here could, have a lot of thoughts on the issue and have, again, are much more eloquent on it than myself. I guess the final takeaway is just we need to be really excited about what DSA is and where we've come. Over the past decade, DSA has gone from a relatively stagnant organization of around 5,000 or so people to one that's on the cusp of getting to 100,000 members. But at the same time, the thing that I always remind myself is when you're in a small group and you go from 5,000 to 25,000, 50,000 to 100,000. Sometimes you just think that the trajectory will just be up and up and up and up. And a lot of our energy becomes about the group and the politics and dynamics and thought within the group. And I think by engaging in, with communities of faith, by engaging in broader working class struggles and just being aware of how weak and fragmented and not rooted still the movement is, I think we could figure out how to actually sustain this growth and how to actually be a very different organization with a very different type of vernacular. I think of DSA as often a great organization that's keeping the seat warm for a set of mass democratic ideas that will one day soon belong to a real much even larger mass of people. So I really applaud your efforts and everyone else here, and I hope to play a small part as well. And yeah.
Wonderful. You're playing a phenomenal part, and thank you for your work. I also appreciate you stretching outside what may be your traditional space of discourse to have the conversation. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Lawrence, Maxine, and Abhay for making this a possibility as well, for all of your respective leadership in this work. Folks, have a great night, and we will reconvene next month in October for our next conversation series on religion and socialism. Take care, everyone. Have a good evening.
All right. Take care. Bye.